Well, Hardy, that's very kind of you to make me so welcome. And because I did not truly expect to be able to come back to Assam, and I was so delighted that Richard's 60th birthday allowed me to do so. And it's been truly an emotional comeback. Because you asked for an anecdote, and one occurs to me because it's about tea, in the sense that when my wife and I were 80, uh, we had a party and we celebrated with our two families. And some of those families hadn't met each other. So I needed something to bring them together. So I had a little questionnaire, and the questionnaire was, which regiment was I in when I did my national service, and which school was Caroline educated in, and all that stuff. And finally, at the 20th question, I thought, well, I must ask something about tea, because that's what I am. And so I said, I'm sure none of you here, and there were about 50 people, I said, I'm sure none of you here will understand what TGFOP means. And I was thinking, none of these guys will know that it's tippy, flowery, golden, orange, pecker. But actually Cedar's daughter, who was about 21 at the time, looked up and said, thank God for old people. TGFOP. I mean, how quick was that?
Yes,
Anyway.
yes.
Um,
Well, going back to tea again, because we are in tea area at the moment, and you have been a complete entity in tea actually. Uh, if I may ask you a few questions on regarding tea, which year did you join, and which year did you eventually leave tea from here in Assam?
well, I joined at the very end of 1955 uh, with Jardines, which were, of course, MacLeod Russell in UK. And I joined at Monavalley. And strangely, I left in 1983 from Monavalley. So it was a complete cycle, really.
But how did you think before you joined tea? How do you think of coming into tea? You had some friends or relatives or
Well,
some.
no, kind of a silly thing happened, really. I was at Reading University doing agriculture, and I got very friendly with an Indian gentleman called Patel. The significance of Patel was lost on me then, but he was a very friendly guy, and because I'd been in the army and I'd been overseas to Hong Kong and Singapore and so on, he said, you would love to be a tea planter. He said, it's outside, it's full of people, it's full of agriculture, and you would love it. And I thought, okay, and it went in one ear and out of the other, perhaps. Anyway, I somewhat disgracefully did not complete my degree, and when I was coming down, I was sitting with a few guys who had completed, and we were all looking for jobs in the press, which was the more common way at that time.
Yeah.
And there were a couple of jobs which interested me. One was banking overseas, and the other was for a tea planter. And I applied, um, and I succeeded in terms of becoming a tea planter.
What were the conditions like when you joined that time, 1955?
Um, well, of course, there was a cultural difference. Like when you when you first arrive in Bombay and you see a fantastically beautiful horizon. Uh, I mean, it is quite it's quite staggering. And then you get, as we did in those days, on a train and trundle across country to Calcutta. And you get out at Calcutta station, and you've never quite seen anything like that before. Um, and you trundle along with a caravan of porters and baggages and all that stuff. Um, I was slightly surprised that the British gentleman who was a company director came to meet me, um, and because some young fellow was climbing all over his car, he came out and said, "Get off my car!" And I thought, that's a bit strange. How does he not speak to them in some Indian language? So there were a few kind of shocks. Calcutta, of course, then was not so busy as it is now. and you were treated uh, individually much more grandly, if you like, than you had been when you were trotting around in UK. But when I came up country, it was quite difficult because it was lonely. It was lonely because you couldn't speak the language. And although you had some idea about agriculture, you couldn't contribute to anything. So I found that a little difficult. And then when I went to a bungalow, actually it was a converted barsha, and it was pretty sparse. And I can remember after a few days lying in my bed and thinking that the tick-ticks were having more fun on the mosquito netting than I was in the house. So, but it was lonely.
But
I was lucky in the sense that the guys around, and particularly a guy comes to mind called Mickey Kidwai, who in some way was a bit less formal than the other guys. I mean the Brit guys really, who should have been more in contact with me perhaps, but it didn't work like that. And Mickey it was that took me into the tea and gave me a pruning knife and said, this is how you prune a bush, because at that time of the year pruning was going on. And truly he taught me how to prune a bush. I got better at it, but similarly he also kindly took me around and introduced me to one of the Sudanis. There weren't many gardens that had Sudanis, I think. And this Sudani was a lady of some character. She got behind me and held my arms, and I was thinking, this is a good place to be, you know. But yes, it was lonely. And
but then how was your interaction with the workers? Was it through somebody, through the staff, or through some...
Well, amazingly, I mean, the first thing that I was encouraged to do was to go to, actually I think he was a Nepalese guy, but anyway, he gave me language lessons, and because I was very impatient to learn, because you felt so useless without the language, I went twice a day to him, and so I did learn to speak the working language reasonably quickly.
A little bit of Hindi.
Yes.
Right.
So,
but
yes.
your working conditions, how have they changed over a period of time since?
Well, I'm not so sure that they have changed so dramatically. What was very apparent to me when I went to Malmapari and to Tarajuli was that the planters have a lot more outside interference, in the sense that they have what they refer to as certification. And that seems to impose quite a lot of rules and regulations, and maybe impositions in many ways. So the current planter doesn't have perhaps the freedom that the old planters did. On the other hand, the current planter has a lot more information. I'm not sure in terms of Toklai and training, but certainly when I came, I went on to Toklai training courses, at least 7 or 8 courses in my first 2 years. I was lucky because the VA in those days lived on Monavari. So whenever somebody else failed to turn up, he said to me, right, you go, because I was the junior assistant and needed to learn, so I was very lucky. And it was a very important part of how you could do your job, if you could learn a bit more about tea.
Talking about the workers during that period and what you saw a little bit this time, do you see a subtle change in them, in their attitudes, in their working conditions,
Well,
what they
I'm not sure that just a quick visit like this is
of course,
in
we
any
understand
way.
that. Yeah.
But what I did feel was that certainly on Tarajuli, where I know it a little better, the Labour seemed pretty happy, and that was, that was quite touching. I didn't really have the opportunity on Monabarry because we were much later in the day and there were not very many labourers. But certainly, when I was on Monabarry particularly, to start with, it was strange in a way because somehow management were more directly involved with the labour to the exclusion of the staff. It seemed, for me to start with, slightly strange that, but in a sense, I guess that was real because clearly the labour were the important people. They were the ones that did all the work, and it was important that you had a relationship with them, which on the one hand had to be friendly, and on the other hand had to be distant. I'm not sure now if they do the same thing, but I mean, every evening as an assistant, you would have at least an hour, maybe 2 hours in the evening, where you had your bichar when somebody came and said, my son gets drunk and beats me up, and in some way you try to make a judgment or helpful. So yeah, I guess we were, as I say, friendly with Labour, but we were also a little distant.
Little distance, yes.
Yeah.
I agree there. You had to maintain that distance
Yes.
because in order to get some action from them.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It was, for example, not the same when I went to the Duars.
Right. Was it different there compared to out here?
It was definitely quite different because here you were represented by the INTUC, who were a reasonable union. In West Bengal, the INTUC was there, but they were pretty toothless, and there were all sorts of unions, basically supported by communism, which made life very difficult. I mean, there was one occasion when my water and my electricity was turned off for 2 weeks. So you learn to survive in those kind of conditions. And it was the time of the Giral, and so on one occasion I was caught in my office.
Was that the Naxalite movement?
It was indeed. It was indeed, and they would surround you at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I actually didn't get out of my office until 4 o'clock the next morning. And it was, not that I'm being personal here, but it was thanks to the Sardaji fitter, who was a bit braver than the other guys, that he managed to smuggle a bottle into me so that I could have a pee.
Oh my God.
Because you were there in the office and you couldn't go anywhere, and it was really very, very difficult. So there were hard times. And incidentally, that estate, which was Bhatpara, I went to it because they understood that I could manage labour. But at the end of my period, it was sold. And now I understand it's been sold once again.
So keep on changing hands all along.
Exactly.
Well, you've had a very, very varied experience in tea, Duars and Assam, going to various gardens. How many gardens do you worked altogether, roughly?
In terms of work directly, only a few.
Okay.
Because basically I went from Monabarry to Bhatpara to Tarajuli as an assistant. And then back to Matelli Morty again as an assistant. Then I went to Bhatpara where I got my first billet. And then from Bhatpara I went to Tarajuli, and I was there for quite a long time, 9 years. And then went from Tarajuli to Monabarry, and that was for just less than 4.
Do you find any social change coming along in the workers? There's more active participation of the management or of the government or of the unions for the workers' benefits?
Well, I don't. It's true to say that with such a quick visit,
we understand.
I can't appreciate those changes. But for sure, I mean, for me, it's quite staggering to see that almost every worker, let alone the Sirdars and the staff and everybody else, have got a mobile at the end of their hand. Now that obviously tells me that they're much better informed, and I presume from that they are therefore more powerful, and I presume therefore that management perhaps have a more difficult and probably a more educated
Right.
way to deal with the
Right.
labour.
Right. You, just cursory visit of yours this time to the various gardens, Monabari and the other garden you went to. Did you find any change in the general outlook of the tea, that what it was in those days and what it is
Well,
now?
interestingly, of course, to look at the tea en masse at this time of the year is not very revealing because so much of it has been pruned. Clearly, the other unpruned areas haven't started to pluck them
True.
yet. I mean, I did see that company policy had changed probably in 2006 from 4 years to 3 year pruning cycle. So that kind of tells me that the company was looking for better quality. Uh, how that quality is sustained throughout the year, I know not. But I guess just from loose talk that they hold the 7-day round through the second flush period and then struggle thereafter. And by the end of the season, they're probably they're in kind of trouble.
Right.
Interestingly, part of that is suggesting that that mechanical harvesting will be introduced.
Do you think that would benefit the tea industry,
I,
or is it's a compulsion that we have
well,
to?
it is a compulsion, and it would be harmful if it wasn't well managed. But if it is well managed, it can be very successful. I mean, I was in Ecuador, for example, and they have part of their area which is flat, and they harvest that with a tracked vehicle. So that is a kind of serious bit of kit. And the sloping areas, they either have shears or motor-driven cutters. I mean, the trick again is to be strict on your round, but the shear workers, particularly from my observation, become quite expert. They know where their cutting level is, and much like the plucker, if they control it,
Selected.
it comes off pretty tidily, and I won't say that it is as good as a good plucker, but it's pretty good. But it is, I mean, I spoke to one or two guys who were thinking that they were going to introduce this year, and it's a difficult task because it's a new technique, they're familiar with the old one, and to learn how to use shears is, but it can, and no doubt will work.
What are your views of your visit here now? When were you here last, when you came here in Assam?
Well, I left in '83, so that was...
That after '83, now this is a visit
I
out here.
have not been back at all.
I see. So from '83 to now, do you see any changes coming in Assam with the people, with the general population, and with the general environment or nature?
I think
Our
for
exposure
sure.
into nature is quite a bit actually now. So
Well,
do you find any change in that?
What the big change for me, I think, is the awareness, certainly of management. Okay, maybe that's been dictated by the accreditation or whatever it is from ISO and rainforests and all the other things that intrude upon. But within the planters themselves, they are all very more conscious and talk more about the environment generally and the global environment, which really I don't think we considered in our day. We were aware of the environment and we enjoyed it, but we were not focused, if you like, on that. And we, I guess, were in a sense an isolated industry. I mean, the government really didn't support us in a way. You kept your own hospital, you kept your own schools, and there was, I mean, one little incident which was meaningful to me was that when we went to Monabari, there was on the right-hand side when you entered the Eastern School, because Roisman had made this high school as an extension from the ordinary basic school. And this time, of course, that sign wasn't there. Why? Because the government had taken over. But that in itself is telling you how things are moving on. The government is now looking after your education. So, yeah, I guess more integration is taking place between the tea community and the general public.
Right, right. What do you think the future of tea industry otherwise actually? You think it's still very bright, or you think there's certain changes are required in general, or?
Well, I mean, to me, the big surprise, if you like, was the fact that total production is now 50% by small holdings. I mean, that really surprised me. I knew it was happening, and I knew there were small holdings, but I had no idea that it was of such a scale. Okay, I had been familiarized with that when I visited Kenya, and that was, part of their structure. So yes, the future of the industry, I think when Coca-Cola appeared on the market and all the other things, and we saw that, if you like, that other brands became more popular. The drinking habits of the world, perhaps because the population is increasing, probably means that the tea industry will survive for quite a long time. How long? I don't think I can predict. Yeah.
Before you left in 83, 83, it would be very interesting to know some very interesting anecdotes during that period.
Well, I suppose the one specific memory that I have was that when I was a new assistant, and so I didn't really know exactly how things worked, there was a planter there called Tony Torrance. And Tony Torrance wasn't the regular planter because he actually flew the light plane for the Megas group. So he was half planter and half pilot. But he had a small problem in that he stuttered really quite badly.
Right.
And the legend goes that one day he was sitting in his assistant's office, and the manager, who was a chap called, doesn't matter what he was called, but he called out, "Torrance!" And so Tony Torrance got up and went into the Borough Sahib's office and said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "What the hell is this?" And he said, "Well, what, sir?" And he said, this indent, what's it for?" He said, "It's for a watch." "Watch, sir?" He said, "A watch?" He said, "We've all got watches. Why do you need a watch?" He said, "Well, I'm a pilot, sir, and I need to know the time." So he said, "Don't be so ridiculous." He said, "Assistants need to know the time. Planters need to know the time. Everybody. Get out of here." So Tony Torrance slunk off and went into his office. And the next day, or maybe the day after, there's suddenly another bellow from the manager, "Torrance!" And Torrance goes in and he said, "What the hell is this?" And there's another indent. And he said, "What's this then?" He said, "It's an indent, sir." "For what?" "For a bag of cement." He said, "You lunatic," he said, "what do you want a bag of cement for?" He said, "Well, sir, if you won't give me a watch," he said, "I'm going to build a sundial." I can't think of another sort of funny quirk at the moment.
No, that was quite nice.
But that's
It has been a pleasure having you here, and we do hope that you will come more often and give us your advice, and it'll be lovely talking to you again and again. And I enjoy your conversations with you because we somehow come into talk in the same level, and
yes.
it's been a pleasure talking to you, sir.
Well,
wish you all the very best.
Thank you very much.
Wish you all
I
the
must say the pleasure is fully reciprocated. And I also do understand when you say that we can talk equally, whereas when I'm at home and I talk to people about tea, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So yeah, I'm very comfortable to be here. And I thank India and I thank the tea industry because it's given me a huge career in tea.
I think
so thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Like I said before, Assam has been very fortunate to have planters like you coming to us and advising us on what to do, how to do, go about it. Your views are definitely very, very welcome, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's my honor.
Thank you.